Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining this podcast. My name is Steven, and I'm representing our faculty's legal hackers. Our guest today is Noah Weisberg. He's the co-founder of two legal AI startups, Kira Systems, as well as his newer project, Zuva, and I'll get him to talk about those. I won't bastardize those for him. He's also written a book called AI for Lawyers, which assists practitioners to incorporate AI into their practices, and before that, practiced as a corporate lawyer in New York. So just on behalf of
two books actually.
I
books. Also am the author of Robbie the Robot Learns to Read, the world's first children's book, as far as we know, on machine learning.
Oh, fantastic. Our listeners should definitely check that one out.
If you got young kids, it's like it rhymes and it's only 256 words.
Amazing. 256. That's a great number as well.
Coincidentally, actually.
Yeah. On behalf of all the legal hackers, as well as the Future of Law Lab run by Josh Morrison, who helped to set this up, as well as for everybody else watching, I'd love to thank Noah for being here today. So to get us started, I'd love for you to talk about the two products that you've created. And yeah, go for it.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I was a corporate lawyer once upon a time at Weil Gotshal in New York. And I spent a lot of time in that job doing work and then supervising people doing work that didn't seem like it should be done the way it was getting done. That junior corporate lawyers spent vast amount, and I was a corporate lawyer, so that's what I was thinking about, but you could probably generalize it to junior lawyers, but junior corporate lawyers for sure spent huge amounts of time doing work that they hated, that they weren't that good at, like they made mistakes at. That was hugely time consuming and repetitive, and that clients hated paying for, and was at huge expense, right? Like back in my day, it was like $300 or $350 an hour. And I think it's like in the $500 to $600 an hour range for sort of someone like you coming out of law school, and you're doing lots of work that just didn't seem like someone like you should be doing. And so I started thinking about that while I was still a lawyer, and I had like one idea and then another idea, but eventually quit being a lawyer and started focusing on just thinking about other ideas and what I should do next. And I started thinking about contracts, and I realized that it fit the theory perfectly, that junior corporate lawyers spent huge amounts of time reviewing contracts. Even at the world's best firms, they made mistakes, but they were often looking for the same things over and over again. And so because they were looking for the same things over and over again, we set out to sort of automate that process at Kira Systems, and had a bit of a struggle in the early days to got together with Dr. Alexander Hudek, who has a PhD in comp sci from Waterloo. And in the early days, we really struggled to get the technology to find information in contracts repeatedly, and especially like as the contracts got more diverse, the problem got harder and harder. And eventually we sort of overcame, and sort of 2.5 years in, we had a system that was pretty good. And now, by the time we exited, which was just this past summer, so summer 21, we had something like 18 of the top 25 global M&A firms using the software. So that included 5 of the seven sisters, 7 of the Vault 10 fanciest New York firm or US firms. I think something like 10 or 11 of the top 12 UK firms by revenue, and other ones throughout the world. And they were using it to make their lawyers do faster and more accurate diligence. Users would tell us that they were reviewing contracts in anywhere from 20 to 90% less time, and that they were doing it with the same or even better accuracy. So in the book, for example, Meredith Williams Range, who's at Shearman, wrote about how their firm had tested our software and people using our software versus people doing the work themselves. And the people were faster who used our software, of course, but they were actually more accurate as well. And I think that was like a pretty consistent thing. So basically, people looking through contracts for stuff like assignment, change of control, if they weren't using Kira, they really kind of weren't doing it as well as it could have been done. And so we had a really good run with that business. Within the business, we saw the opportunity for so many more uses past kind of corporate lawyer contract review. And specifically, we thought that there was just huge opportunity inside enterprises, like businesses, to help them review their contracts. So whether it meant like negotiating better contracts when they went to do exits, or helping them with their contract management system, or just understanding what was there, we saw and so many sort of specific niche opportunities inside financials and insurance companies and medical companies and like all sorts of different areas when this kind of came up as something that could really, like, our underlying technology could really help. But the problem was there were so many different great opportunities there. And we really, I think, spent a lot of time thinking about how we could best impact that market. And we were big enough at Kira Systems, like in the kind of, 150, 200, I think we got up to as big as like 240 at one point. We were big enough that we could sort of have some other teams working on how to get Kira adopted in other industries. But what we found was that our focus, that it split our focus. So we couldn't thrive at doing both selling to law firms and selling to corporates, we felt. And eventually Litera and we got approached to sell ourselves. And we weren't that excited about that because we really thought there was so much more to do in the business. But there were things that we liked about it. And what we realized looking at Litera was that they were a company that was totally focused on the legal market, or almost totally focused on the legal market. And we thought, as we looked at them, that they might even do a better job of getting our contract analysis technology to be ubiquitous within law firms. And that really excited us, number one. Number two, they were willing to pay a amount of money that we found appealing. But number three, because they were so focused on law firms, we realized that there was an opportunity to carve out the businesses that really, or a pair of businesses that really excited us with taking our underlying technology to corporates. And Litera was game to do that deal, which I really credit them and HG who backed them for being sort of open-minded and creative enough to see the enhanced value from doing that kind of deal. And so we did the spin out, and out of the spin out, we created a company called Zuva. And we got to take about 34 really fantastic people, almost all product people, who were working on kind of building and improving our machine learning and those sort of two new product lines, and a couple other people. So it was a bit hairy at the start with not having much administrative help. But we kind of persevered and pushed through as a team. And we now have a company that's about 40 people with Zuva. We have one product in market, and another one that we're working on still. The product that is in market is called Document AI. And what it enables our users to do is take what we think is the world's best contract analysis software that sort of in the course of building Kira, we were just sort of at that problem for a long time. We invested a ton of money in it. By the end, we were investing kind of like millions of dollars a year in improving our contract analysis tech. And we've been doing it for more than a decade, not at $1 million a year in the early days or anything, but eventually kind of got up to that kind of pace. So we were spending like a vast amount of money on building the best contract analysis tech, teaching it to find new concepts. And what Zuva has is that technology, but we packaged it up in an API so that if you're building a legal tech product and you need, or any kind of tech product, and you need details from contracts in it, you can incorporate our technology and just have the sort of best in the world technology and make it easily embeddable into your application. So it's what Zuva is all about, is just giving easy access to what we think is the world's best contract analysis tech. So that may have been a more long-winded answer than you needed, but
No, that was absolutely
here we
perfect.
are.
It's amazing to see the democratization of such powerful tools. And, you know, as you said, the profession's already incredibly expensive. And hopefully this means that that'll reduce some of the costs of lawyers as some of their lower grade work gets automated.
I don't actually know that I'm not convinced. Maybe like it may reduce the cost. What I think it does, what I'm more confident of, is that it increases the value, right? So I think there's actually a lot of situations when lawyers could perhaps get away with heavier bills to clients if the client thought they were getting great value from what the lawyer charged, right? So, for example, one of the things that we always saw was with due diligence exercises where you're buying another company, for example, that law firms, like when I practiced and still to today, typically do a pretty trimmed down due diligence. Like they might look at 100 or 200 contracts on a potential buy, when in fact the target company might have 5 or 10,000, right? So they're looking at like 5% of all the total contracts or less. And the reason that they're only looking at 5% is kind of because no one thinks it's worth it to look at the rest of the stuff. But in fact, there could be like awful stuff lurking in the unreviewed contracts, and you just wouldn't know because you never opened them. And so you're just kind of like, ideally it works out and like thinking it works out, but like if it doesn't work out, it can be really, really, really bad. And so what the technology allows you to do is offer your clients an ability to potentially look at a whole lot more contracts. So if you think about that situation, you look at a whole lot more contracts, like the bill may not go down, the bill may go up, but you're giving the client protection that they never would have had without the technology. So I think that's just, again, another tangent, but
no, have you seen that in practice? Is that the feedback that you get from
yeah,
lawyers? Is that
yeah, that was actually something we started to kind of, we would sometimes see people doing larger projects. So for example, one of my favorite examples of that, which is also written up in the AI for Lawyers book, a Wall Street Journal bestseller, I might add. But one thing that's written up in there is the German company Daimler, maker of Mercedes-Benz automobiles, among other things, was doing a hive down transaction where they were splitting into a cars division and a trucks division. And so they need to review, when you do a kind of spin outy transaction, you got to review a lot of contracts because some contracts are going to one place and some contracts are going to another place. And you got to make sure that's okay and that everything's online. So Daimler, in a typical transaction like that, like this is like a big, like tens of billions of dollars transaction, typical transaction like that, you're going to review probably 25 to 50,000 contracts. And they had Skadden helping them. And that's like an expensive thing when Skadden is helping you do it, right? It's like 50 people working for a year will review 50,000 contracts. Daimler raised an interesting question though, which was like, even if we review 50,000 contracts, like we think we're passing 1 million contracts, or like we think there's 1 million implicated contracts. And so in fact, we might spend 50 million euros on reviewing these 50,000 contracts and still have only reviewed 50,000 out of 1 million potential contracts. So like, how do we get comfortable with that and saying that we reviewed everything when we got to go to our board? And so they talked to Skadden and decided to use technology and ended up selecting our technology. And in the end, they were able to review, turned out instead of having 1 million contracts, they actually had 4 million contracts, and they made it through. They had sort of a year deadline by the time the deal, by the time they had to have their piece done, and they made it through, and they made it through with a team of under 10 reviewers. And it wasn't cheap, but it actually, I think in a way was more affordable than reviewing 50,000 contracts manually would have been by a lot. And in the meantime, they were able to sort of be a lot more certain that they were doing the deal right. So we have seen it, and I think we will see it more and more. In fact, I had a really interesting conversation with the general counsel of a large law firm where he sort of said that it wouldn't necessarily be malpractice it was unclear to him that someone could raise a claim for malpractice if you didn't offer your client the ability to look at everything if something went wrong, right? Like if you didn't review all the contracts and there was something hidden in one of the contracts that ended up screwing up the deal later. And there have been instances where things have been hit, like things where contract reviews get screwed up or whatever. And like things can go really, really, really wrong in that type of case, like especially if there's kind of a buried exclusivity or non-compete, like it can be very bad. And this general counsel, big firm general counsel's perspective was, if you just talk to your client and the client said, no, I don't feel like doing that, then you were probably covered. But if you never talked to your client about it, he thought a client could raise, an unhappy sort of nasty client could raise a claim of malpractice against you. And he didn't know if you'd win or lose, but he saw it as there. So
Probably still costly to fight in either case.
well, and it's like a pretty bad outcome. Like some of the costs involved in missing an exclusivity can like kick into the hundreds of millions, billions of dollars. And like it has happened before where there's been really extensive costs. So, it's one where if you lost, you'd really lose.
Right. Really interesting. So do you see this as like a broader trend of lawyers gaining access to more of these AI tools, and maybe their workload is not really changing too much, but they're just becoming better at doing their jobs?
Yeah, that's I think the right way to think of it. That maybe your work isn't changing, but like overall, bad news is you go to like a Bay Street firm or a fancy New York firm or whatever, you're probably going to be working pretty hard, right? Like it just is what it is in that job. And there's always going to be a way that you're working hard. What this does though, is I think the trend towards AI helping more with law practice is that it'll just have you spend time doing things that you should be doing for $500 an hour, right? Actually, as a person, that may make your days even more tiring, right? Because what it's going to mean is higher intellectual intensity tasks. But I think that overall should be something that lawyers cheer and their clients as well.
Right. I know there's a concern that often new lawyers don't really understand what they're doing and how it impacts like the broader legal strategy and the actual interests of the client. So, as they move to these higher order sort of tasks, I guess they'd be better at seeing those sorts of things too.
Yeah, I think so. Like if you're doing higher order tasks, you're going to have more mental stuff there. I think the other thing is, just as a junior lawyer, like if you're working at a firm that isn't using this kind of technology, you really gotta question if you're getting trained the right way. I think that I think you can quibble with whether like AI in law practice is ubiquitous today. Like actually, it's obviously not ubiquitous. Like there's lots of tasks that I think will be automated in the future that aren't now. I think there's some areas like contract review where it's pretty market norm in some markets and still developing in others, right? So maybe you can say like, I don't think this is the market standard. I don't think I have to do that. And like you can fine, like you can say that. I don't necessarily agree with you in all cases, but there's definitely markets where I'd agree. But in 10 years, do you really believe that's going to be true? Or 5 years? Like, do you really believe that's going to be true? Like, there's going to be like a car driving you in without a driver. Like my car, like you can already get like a Tesla that'll like drive you pretty decently on the highway. And you got to believe in 5 or 10 years that there's going to be some pretty amazing things coming out of AI. And the idea that it's not going to heavily impact law practice it seems like pretty aggressive to me and high risk. So then if you think about that as a junior lawyer, if you're graduating from law school now and 10 years from now, you're going to be like a junior partner, then you kind of have to question if you're going to be a junior partner who knows how to use tools that are a daily part of your life. And I can say from having used AI tools, like the best way to get used to them is to get used to them, start using them, right? And if you're coming out, if you're at a firm where they don't adopt these tools until like 7 years from now, when they're like the last adopters, it's going to mean you don't know how to do something that people at other firms do know how to do. And I think that puts you at a real disadvantage, like just as a lawyer. So I think just in terms of learning, first of all, it'll make your job more interesting if you're using this stuff. But secondly, I think in terms of being a decent lawyer in the future, getting experience at this now is just something I would do, irrespective of how aggressively you think technology is going to be part of your work.
So following that thread, what do you think up and coming lawyers need to understand about AI and machine learning? Do they just need to practice with these tools? Do they need to have a deeper understanding about the inner workings?
I don't think you need to know the inner workings. I think good tools like ours, ideally, they just kind of work. And the AI is just another feature of the tool. Like, in fact, there are lots of things we do with Kira, like some of the most impactful features. Certainly the AI was a very impactful feature, but a lot of the group collaboration features that we did too, which are not at all AI, were also super impactful. And I don't think you need to, with us, we had it built so that the technology was there, but you never had to like talk to a comp sci PhD. Like, we had them on our team, they were working, but the comp sci PhDs were working in such a way that you could even train our software to find something new without ever having to talk to a technologist. So I really am, it's nice, like if you're interested in learning how this stuff works, that's great. I think actually in a more AI enhanced practice world, you sort of need the same tools for success that you do in a non-AI enhanced practice world, which are an attention to detail and caring about getting things right and your work product. Like, those are the things that'll help you. And if you're just kind of open-minded, minimally technically competent, you can figure the rest out. Like, the people who are going to U of T Law or elsewhere are smart enough to understand what they need to out of this. And in an AI world, they should be just fine. And in fact, if you're training an AI, note that AI learns best when it's taught well. And to learn well from lawyers, like, you actually learn better from people who are kind of better lawyers in some ways, right? And consistent and can teach things the same way. So I think those are just standard lawyer skills, not necessarily AI skills. And I think it's great if you know how AI works, but honestly, you shouldn't need it to use good AI tools.
Do you think that there's the ability to see opportunities from having that kind of knowledge in perhaps, new growth areas in the field of AI? Or
I think if your goal is not necessarily to be a great lawyer, but to start a business that helps other lawyers do their jobs better, then I think it can help to understand what's possible with AI. But even then, I don't know that you need to go take like a computer science class or anything like that. But I think a high level understanding of things that are possible with AI, and then an ability to analogize from there, which you should have done fine on your LSAT or whatever. I think that skill will sort of drive you pretty far, right? Like, ultimately, if you're going to build a sophisticated AI tool, one, you may be able to just incorporate AI from places like Zuva or Google or something you find on Hugging Face in the future. Like, you may not need to kind of do the same original research that Alex and our research team have to do. That may take you to where you need to go. It may not, but which is what we found. Like, we thought the off-the-shelf stuff would work well in our situation, and it did not when we first tried. So, but I think that ability to just kind of see a situation and say, like, this might work, you do better at it the more you knew about AI. But I think you can do that even without a terrific AI background.
Awesome. So what do you think, which substantive areas in the field of AI do you think are best positioned for growth at the moment? I know you have contract review down pat, but I'm sure you've seen other opportunities throughout your journey.
Yeah, I think so for where I expect to see AI in law, I think, because I would never comment on, broad, like,
Sure,
computer
sure.
vision is going to be hot or something like that in AI. Like that's not an area where I know it super well. But in law, um, you got a few areas that are a bit more built out. So I think contract analysis both is adopted, but I think there's still actually tons more room for more adoption around contracts related tasks. So I expect to see tons more development there. E-discovery in litigation is obviously another area that's like pretty developed, but I think still has room for more adoption. And then a third area that's also pretty developed is legal research, right? Like you're typing a query and trying to find relevant cases or maybe statutes. There is AI already helping you a bunch, and I think we'll just see more and more of that. So those are probably like big three. Right now, I think you also see expert systems are actually pretty heavily adopted in some areas, right? So say rule sets trying to help people through interpreting complex regulations or the like. I think there's some good heavily adopted systems there. And finally, I think legal prediction kind of stands out as an area where people like Anthony Niblett and Benjamin Allaire are really showing that you can make a real impact with using AI. Further out, I think like as a general rule, what I like to think about is if you're doing something that seems like highly repetitive, that it's probably ripe for some kind of automation. And what I'd actually counsel people who are thinking about doing a business in this area is like, think about the areas of tasks where people spend a lot of time on them and focus your efforts on thinking about if you can help there. So as a lawyer, I would kind of flip that around a little, which is if you're doing something super repetitive that seems like there is a way to automate it, someone may well be able to figure out a way to automate it. So either like go try to find that technology, build that technology yourself, but don't get kind of hooked on the fees from doing something that a computer seems maybe more apt to do in the future.
Awesome. So moving a bit towards COVID, how do you think COVID has affected AI, I guess, in the industry generally, in terms of like maybe adoption among lawyers?
So I think at first it probably didn't help at first, because I think law firms especially were super focused back in like March, April, May, June 2020 on just getting their feet on the ground and making sure everybody had like a laptop and Zoom and pretty standard stuff. But I think it really over time has likely strengthened how firms IT infrastructure is. I remember talking to the CIO of a Magic Circle firm, one of our Kira customers, and he was saying, right now the spend of real estate to tech is whatever ratio, and it was like 10-1 or something like that. And he's like, I don't know that that's the appropriate ratio. And so I think that as firms and lawyers get more comfortable working with tools that are different than the way that they always did it, I think it kind of opens their mind to using tools that may happen to have AI in them. But hard to say. Certainly getting lawyers to adopt new technology is, I found it real work.
Right. So maybe as a follow-up to that, then, like over the course of your entire business, how has that adoption looked? So I imagine at the start it was probably much harder than it is today, but
yeah, it's a grind, right? Like, so I'm not in the I help out with Latera occasionally, but mostly I'm in the Zoofa business right now. So I can't say how it is as accurately as some of my old teammates, right? Like today, as we talk, April 1st, 2022, like I do not know it as well as some other people in the law firm adoption space, because I just haven't been in it day to day for 7 or 8 months, even though I help out a bit here and there and talk to people. But over the sort of decade that preceded that, I would say that it's a grind, right? Like you're going lawyer by lawyer and trying to get them to try doing things new. And it's not exactly lawyer by lawyer, maybe. Like sometimes it's a bit more impactful to you get like a practice group chair who's excited by the idea and things can flow down from there. But it's definitely not like it's a more steady.
Not a hockey stick, I guess.
Well, not a hockey stick in terms of, well, it probably was a hockey stick in some ways, but like it's still a lot of work.
Gotcha.
Like our growth was actually, we had some nice years of growth at Kira Systems. Not every single year, but nonetheless, it is no trivial task to get lawyers to adopt new technology.
Yeah, that's a tale as old as time.
Yeah, you know what one thing is though, like people take that to mean that lawyers don't adopt new technology, and I think that is an entirely false myth. If you think about lawyers, like when they adopt, they actually tend to adopt quite ubiquitously. So there's things like blacklining software, that like document comparison software, that once upon a time, people did these comparisons between documents by sending the document off to like secretarial pool, and they would like use rulers to compare documents. And eventually people got comfortable with using technology, and now like everybody uses technology all the time. Same thing with legal research, right? Like when I was a kid, my dad was a partner at a big Toronto firm, and there was like a library on like a floor in the firm. And now there's still librarians, but it's much more electronic legal research, and that became ubiquitously adopted. And I think there's tons of examples if you go back through history of lawyers ubiquitously adopting technology. So I don't think they're actually as bad as they sort of get a rep for being, but it's still real work to get them to do things a new way.
Sure. Do you think that legal tech companies are driving AI and machine learning forward as a whole, or do you think that this industry is sort of piggybacking off of maybe other AI industries in their software?
Well, I think there's like a cultural, so I guess there's different ways that I can interpret that question. One of them is like on the technological side, and one of them is on the sort of user adoption side. On the user adoption side, I think that it certainly doesn't hurt. Like we were talking about before, that you're going to have a self-driving car driving you to work, that AI is everywhere in the conversation. I think that helps prepare lawyers for the question of like, if AI is everywhere, why isn't it in my practice? So I think that is definitely helpful. Though I think legal tech companies probably have a lot of their own, certainly at Kira, we had a lot of work to do ourselves in terms of pushing adoption. And like, that's why Alex and I wrote AI for Lawyers, right? Like it wasn't because we needed something to fill up our summer. It was because we thought it would help us get more adoption. In terms of the technology, I think there's also a range there. Like at Kira Systems, I think we found on contracts that a lot of the off the sort of shelf stuff that you get from like big tech companies wasn't, we thought the technology that we built was kind of better for our use case. But I think there's other areas where, background research, things that are going on in the world are pushing important advances. Like I think of case text, for example, as adopting some kind of, usefully adopting some things that exist in the world. And I think that's really positive. So I think you certainly benefit from what's going on in the world. But there's still a lot of independent work by legal tech companies, both on adoption and technology development. There's also ways that things go outside. Like in fact, with Zuva, we think a lot of the opportunity is to help non-legal tech companies embed contracts intelligence into everyday software, like their CRM or ERP system. And I think over time, we'll start to see that play out, right? Where there's obviously still going to be legal tech software, but I think there'll just be corporate, like enterprise tech software that might have some legal attributes in it. And you're seeing things like that pop out. Like, for example, the other week I saw Artificial Lawyer writing up how ServiceNow is launching, function or has launched functionality that targets legal operations and like an in-house general counsel. And I think we'll see kind of more and more of that, where some legal tech will go sort of mainstream, some mainstream tech will go legal. I just don't think there's a hard and fast rule. Again, I may have gone on a bit of a tangent there, and I apologize if so.
Absolutely no worries at all. Switching gears, I guess, a little bit. I ran a working group this year regarding some of the issues that AI in the legal tech space face. So like certain kinds of bias that may present in algorithms, some like more like academic, I guess, sort of criticisms, like the idea that predictive analytics can like freeze laws or contracts, I guess, applied to Kira in place. And that might, have an effect on innovation. What are your thoughts on some of these issues? Or do you think that rather than freezing things in place and preventing innovation, maybe they save time by covering the typical bases that lawyers, need to be doing, and maybe open room for like higher order things like creative solutions or just higher order tasks entirely?
So you get two separate issues there. One, the bias, two, the freezing in place, though there could be other criticisms you might, or serious questions you might raise. In terms of bias, it was never something we had to deal with too much at Kira Systems. Like, we would bias our algorithms towards like precision or recall, depending on what we were trying to achieve. A lot of the times in our case towards recall, which means like less misses, but more false positives. But it wasn't so much like, their contracts, like you're trying to find the provision in the contract accurately. So it's not like there are situations, for example, software that maybe helped guide a court to a sentence, or helped, like if you think about Minority Report and like who might have committed a crime, or like there certainly are situations, or who is guilty, who is not guilty. Even in Brazil, I think they have an algorithm that helps select which cases get picked up by their Supreme Court. Those situations raise really complicated bias issues. Happily, or for better or worse, with contracts, it's like, literally, is this a change of control clause or not? It's just like you're just trying to find a change of control clause, right? Like there's no
legal
someone
AI
might someone might take that output and do something more interesting, but happily, I never had to get too sophisticated on these bias issues. Whereas I definitely think there are super interesting bias issues around some legal tech. So that's piece number one. Piece number two, does it ossify what's going on? I think with contract review software, which is the thing I am most knowledgeable about, I don't think it does. I think it, like literally our problem at Kira and at Zuva is we're trying to find clauses accurately. Now, clauses aren't static, right? They get written differently all the time. And in fact, like the difference between like, the year 2000 variation of an exclusivity clause versus the year 2020 variation, or a force majeure clause, right? Like something you can totally see is different today than it was 2 years ago. Like we did a couple studies in 2020, and like barely any force majeure clauses contain pandemics as like an example of a force majeure, right? Like it was like under 30% or something like that, right? And like, I bet you if we did the study now, which we haven't even bothered to do, a lot of them would have it. Similarly, I think there's probably a lot of contracts that have like an inflation adjustment clause in them, if they're getting written today, that probably, wasn't as common 5 years ago, right? 3 years ago. So I think those things change, and they're not really a big deal, right? Like in terms of building technology, because what's an even bigger change is the fact that you're trying to make technology that works on a Canadian contract or a UK contract or an Australian contract or a US contract. And like or maybe even a contract that's like written between two Latvian, or like a Latvian company and a Norwegian company, written in English, right? By a set of people who may speak good English, but it's like not their first language. Like that literally is the problem that you're dealing with. And the difference between, and you still need the software to find that exclusivity clause in that Latvian governed contract, even though it's written in English. And like the differences between that Latvian governed contract and a contract that like Osler's is doing in Toronto are way bigger than the differences between like 2018 force majeure versus 2022 force majeure. Like they're just not even close. And for us, the problem that we're trying to do is just find the stuff accurately. So, the world is kind of has a whole lot of different ways to phrase these things, and that's just a problem we have to deal with, right? Like a related topic is kind of contract standardization, and sometimes I can remember there's one leader in my space who was like, if everybody just wrote their contracts in a standardized way, it'd be super easy to pull out the data accurately. And it's like, okay, sure, true, but like, that doesn't seem too imminent to me. Like it'd be great if it happened, but it doesn't seem too imminent. And we just need to build software that deals with the world as we have it. And so I think if you're building software that deals with the world as we have it, it's kind of unlikely to cause ossification. And I think it just more needs to be able to handle change. If you were using software to like look at past contracts to sort of write future ones, where you see that, I've seen that proposed. I think software can be like a bit of a help, but I always found this guy, Ken Adams, who I always found had like a very, a perspective on that resonated with me, which was just like, the way to write a good contract for now is to write the good contract for now. Like if you look at stuff that was done in the past, it might be a helpful data point, but it's still going to be screwed up. That like an actual person needs to, like that's a high value person task to get someone to go and write things the right way. So I think if that's happening, you don't really have to worry too much about the ossification point either.
Gotcha. In terms of proprietary information as that relates to the input data that like all these AI are being trained on, how do you feel that like our society is like structured? Do you feel like maybe big firms have a larger advantage when it comes to this stuff, and smaller firms will be like forever prejudiced? Like how do you feel that information, I guess, flows in our sort of legal atmosphere, and how should it?
I don't know that you could, well, in terms of how it should flow, I'm not sure I can give like a great answer there. Like as a practical thing, yeah, like big firms, especially firms with specific practice area focuses, I think are at a bit of an advantage when it comes to untrained AI software. For example, if you had a big like aircraft leasing business, you might be able to both have more documents to train the software on and the people to train the software who really knew what they were looking for in that area than someone who didn't have that. And that can help cement an advantage for someone who's already there. That said, I think a lot of the software comes pre-trained for useful information out of the box. So for example, with Zuva's AI automatically finds like 1,200 data points out of the box. So not like there aren't more things to train. People use the underlying technology to teach it an additional, our customers, Kira used it to teach it an additional 20,000 additional data points. So like there are more things to train it on, but some of those 20,000 may be the same, right? Like they just didn't share it with each other. Or maybe things that we later built out models for. But I think many AIs, if there's a big enough demand, will end up doing pre-trained stuff. And so that'll make it okay for small firms. Let's not forget also that some small firms can have very specialized knowledge as well, right? Like there are small firms that aren't generalists, right? Like they're a pipeline law boutique or something like that. And so they may actually have plenty of training data on their narrow area, or construction law or something like that, right? Like it doesn't necessarily advantage just big firms, but it advantages people who have specialized knowledge, both like knowledge and access to documents.
Right. And so how much of this data like is inputted from firms to like Kira and these other softwares, and how much of it like comes in-house from you guys and your legal researchers?
We found like I don't know what the Kira numbers are on it now, but I think like probably for many firms they would be using 90% out of the box Kira, and they'd be training it on 10%. Right. And actually, like it probably broke down that many firms that used it like 99% out of the box, and a few firms that trained it on like 20% or 30% or 100% if they were, for example, we had firms in like Germany or Brazil, right? Like if you're using it in or Portugal, like if you're using it in Portugal and you're not using it on English language docs, then you're probably going to train it. And that's what happened.
Great. What are your thoughts on the regulatory landscape as it relates to AI? Have you heard? I'm sure you've heard about like the sandbox that's been contemplated in a few jurisdictions.
Yeah, like I'm probably not as sophisticated on. I've certainly heard of places doing the sandbox. I think it's great, like as a personal thing, like not my business interests or anything like that, but as a personal thing, I am troubled by regulations that limit competition for lawyers. And like I think I can understand why some people support them, but I think they're pretty problematic and sort of suggest a conflict of interest, which should worry a lot of lawyers. So in general, I support enabling, like we certainly have an access to justice crisis. Not enough people can get access to lawyers, I think actually that access to justice crisis extends like even up to the biggest companies, right? Where there are legal problems that they have that they don't get solved, right? Like middle-class people have access to justice problems in the sense that it's probably lots of disputes they enter into, contracts that they enter into where they don't bother to get a lawyer because it's too expensive, or the more accurately, maybe the pricing and packaging of the legal product is not one that appeals to them. But I think there's lots of situations where people don't get legal advice who could use it. And I think it's hard to look at that and think that the current way of delivering legal services doesn't have some systematically wrong parts to it. But beyond that, I can't say like, I like the Law Society of Ontario's proposal or anything like that. Like, it's just not, I know there's smart people thinking about that. And I got enough going on where I leave it.
Yeah, there are obviously like tensions between, those access to justice concerns, as well as like, duties of competence and ensuring that, like, especially at the bottom echelon of things, people getting information that will actually help them solve their legal problems.
Yeah, like if it's false information or something like that, like that's a problem. But
so there's obviously a concern where you're democratizing it so much that like or maybe not democratizing is the wrong word, but like you're allowing access to so many people, for instance, and with some legal tools. I'm thinking of one called Do Not Pay. I'm sure you've heard of it.
Yeah. I don't think it's like I can see restrictions around like some certain things. For example, like if you get a will, like I'm not saying a lawyer needs to draft a will. It could be that a service like LegalZoom might actually do a perfectly fine job, but there's like strict rules, and like stuff could go pretty wrong if you don't follow those strict rules, and you won't find out until later. Certainly, like if you're going to court, and especially if it's like a criminal matter or something like that, like I can see why you might feel like a certain standard on that type of thing. But I think there's a lot of everyday stuff where I'm skeptical that certainly there may be advantages to restricting who can do it, but there's some significant disadvantages too. And I'm not sure that I can say that the advantages in a situation where there's just so many people who don't have access to justice services that they need, that you can say that you can really feel good about how things are working right now. Like, I just think it's like there's such an overwhelming greater need for legal services, and the current system, for whatever reason it is not not enabling all those needs to be met. And I think that's actually really like an exciting opportunity for lawyers as well, right? That like there's tons of people who need lawyers who don't have them. And so, maybe if you open things up, it'll actually create greater opportunities to serve more people.
And do you think there's any regulation that doesn't exist, maybe a framework for these new companies coming into the market that is needed, or do you think that's just not necessary?
Yeah, I tend to be a little bit more laissez-faire, and like it doesn't scream out to me. I think there's overarching things that you need to do around like confidentiality and helping preserve client confidentiality and the like. But I think a lot of lawyers are pretty careful with that type of stuff and making sure their vendors have it. I think beyond that, again, there are areas where, like we were talking about before with criminal justice bias, where I definitely think you need to be a lot more careful. But I think there's, if someone's selling a contract management system, like, should there be regulation on that? Like beyond the standard, like data protection and other background obligations that apply to everyone? Probably not.
Yeah. And from my perspective of reading a lot of the academic perspectives, it definitely seems like AI has been like put into this one sort of broad box, and clearly like it needs disambiguation in all these like different aspects of it, right?
Yeah, like totally. Like your credit card fraud like detection provider, like should that be heavily regulated?
Right.
Like, Amazon book recommendations, like should those be regulated? Like, there's probably people like maybe, I know we're getting into like
Amazon reviews, perhaps.
like, yeah, totally. Like we're getting, maybe we're going to try, but I have a hard time thinking that stuff should, but there's certainly areas where I think we need to be careful. And probably most areas of AI are not those. Like a lot of stuff is like,
right. So certainly for people who are interested in like these judicial tools, for instance, they should be paying close attention to what they're doing, keeping a close eye on their
if you're doing like highly regulated stuff, like or making like credit decisions or insurance decisions or something like that, like I can see how there may be room for AI. I think there's also interesting things around like using people's training data inappropriately, where it can be pretty interesting. Like, for example, around advertising and like how people decide to advertise to you. That may be an area where, as much as anything, you're controlling not the AI, but like just what inputs it's getting. Like when you have the right to be private. I think there's interesting questions there, but I think lumping it all into AI is not a useful way to think of it. Not to say that regulation won't get done that way, but
right. Josh had this idea about the journalistic industry and how, as that got democratized, we sort of saw like a shift away from like, I don't know, authenticity, care for correctness, and things of that nature.
Not authenticity, but authoritativeness, maybe.
Yeah, sure.
I would say journalism right now is maybe more authentic and less.
I think it's more in line with like the alternative sort of media and like sort of new ways of like getting these existing services that like that industry is expanded in that sense. I'm wondering if you see any connection between that parallel and like the legal industry, where as legal tools become democratized, and probably not so much for like contract review tools, but for things like do not pay, for more like user like directly to end user type things. What are your thoughts there?
It's interesting because if you think about like journalism, I wonder, are we better served by journalism today than we were 30 years ago or something like that? Like I don't know. There's more voices. There's probably ways that we're better served and ways that we're worse served right now.
Certainly have more information, but that doesn't seem to be the only important.
We have more information, though. On the other hand, the like traditional places that did like like there's something to be said for like the traditional high quality, in-depth investigative reporting. And I think that there's probably less resources available to do that at some traditional media outlets. On the other hand, there's more at other places, and like, BuzzFeed and the like have actually done good in-depth research too. So I
True.
wonder how that's changed. I will say the times at Kira when we got to interact with people from the like highest end publications, like if you're in like the New York Times or the Economist or something like that, like and we were in both, and it's like the level of rigor at those places is pretty extreme, and like fact checking and the like, and even a big step down compared to like dealing with like a local newspaper, where I think once upon a time they would have had that level of rigor and they don't now. So you see that. But anyways, this is kind of it's a super sort of opposite to something I'm super dull. Like no one feels like hearing Noah Weisberg talk about the media in 2022.
Now we got podcasting.
Yeah, totally. But like, well, you think about podcasting, right? Like there's so many interesting conversations and like being able to hear like the depth. So it probably cuts both ways. I think overall, the more we can kind of put things into the world, right? Like the more building blocks are out there where people can build companies and deliver. So by building blocks, like things like Zuva, but also the regulatory openness to enable these problems to be solved, I think we will see interesting things happen, and there'll be problems that are solved in the future that, like, there's certainly, as we discussed before, tons of people who aren't getting their legal needs addressed. And I think as more tools are out there to make it cheaper to build a company, that make it more regulatorily easy to build a company, that'll probably yield things that surprise us in a positive way, and maybe sometimes negative way too, but
Right.
Mostly I think positive.
Okay. Do you think hard cases make bad predictive models?
It depends what you're trying to build. At Kira, we were always trying to build software that was quite robust, right? We were worried that if you got contracts, like you have no idea where they could be from. They could be, from a grain company, they could be from a bank, they could be from a satellite operator, and they could be from an Estonian timber company. And you just gotta be able to handle those long tail contracts. But the minus to handling some of those long tail contracts is it means you probably have some lower accuracy in normal situations. And so I think you really got to decide, whether you'd like robustness against poor quality scans or Estonian timber contracts, or, Chinese joint ventures, or whatever the case may be, or if you'd like it to be really great on a more narrow set of use case. And like, it's not like a 1-for-1 trade-off. I think you can have it be really good at the sort of main use case and also handle the long tail, but there is a bit of a trade-off between those things, right? And so I wouldn't say hard cases make for bad predictive models, but like, in fact, I think they make for better predictive models if you're trying to have the predictive model be able to handle some situations that are not all the same. But you got to make sure then that you get enough of the hard cases that it kind of balances on both sides of the model. Like model building is itself a deep, extensive subject.
Right. Maybe I'll just ask you one final question for all the aspiring legal tech entrepreneurs at U of T. Do you have any words of wisdom, tips and tricks?
I would say it's a really exciting time to be getting into law. There's so much opportunity for improvement in how law is practiced. And I think there's an increasing willingness to improve things. So I think you're getting into law at a great time. And I would think about just, if you're trying to automate a legal process, it really helps if you know it well, and if you're actually a good lawyer. not saying it's the only way. Like there's certainly people in legal tech who will be very forthright that they were not good lawyers and got into this because of something else. But I think if you are a good lawyer, it really helps, right? That like, first of all, if you're trying to get a piece of technology adopted, it's a small community. And if people know that you were a decent lawyer before, it'll help you. If sort of your ex-colleagues say that you were good at your job, it'll go a long way in terms of getting you farther faster. Not to say you can't if it's not your thing, but I would just focus on that. Like, do a great job at the job that you go into and keep your eye out for things to automate. And there are lots.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here, Noah. This has been a really insightful hour and a little bit.
So talking about media and everything. Like,
yeah. I know
awesome.
You've
Thanks
already been involved at U of T before, so thank you again for your continued engagement with us. It's always really informative and great. So really appreciate it from everyone at U of T here.
Yeah, great law school. I'm though I did not go there, I feel I am fond of, my dad did, and I'm very fond of it, and always happy to help out.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And we'll see you around.
Awesome. Have a great day.